Let us start with a number, 12,500,000. That is the minimum number of African men, women, and children who were forcibly loaded onto slave ships and transported across the Atlantic Ocean between 1500 and 1900. That number does not include the millions more who died before they ever reached a ship, killed in raids, executed as unprofitable, or who perished on the march to the coast. It does not include the estimated 2 million who died on the Middle Passage, the ocean crossing, and were thrown overboard. The transatlantic slave trade is usually taught as a moral story, and it is a moral story, one of the greatest crimes in human history. But here is what that moral framing almost always leaves out. This was, above everything else, an economic system. It was not a crime of passion. It was not an accident of history. It was a carefully architected, legally sanctioned, internationally financed, and extraordinarily profitable commercial enterprise with shareholders, insurance policies, balance sheets, and annual reports. It was run by corporations, backed by governments, insured by banks that still exist today, and it generated the capital that directly funded the Industrial Revolution, and therefore the modern Western world as we know it. Today we are going to follow the money, all of it. Who built this system, who profited from it, what it cost Africa, and why those costs are still being felt right now in Lagos and London, in Accra and Atlanta, in Kinshasa and Kingston. This is not about guilt. This is about accuracy, and accuracy has consequences. To understand the economics of the transatlantic slave trade, you have to understand the problem it was designed to solve. By the 15th century, European powers, beginning with Portugal and Spain, had begun colonizing the Atlantic islands and then the Americas. They found land, extraordinary amounts of land that could grow sugar, tobacco, cotton, rice, and indigo, crops that were in explosive demand in European markets and could generate almost unimaginable profits. But land without labor is worthless, and they had a labor problem. Their first solution was indigenous American labor. They enslaved the native populations of the Caribbean and South America, but the indigenous peoples died in catastrophic numbers from European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, to which they had no immunity. Within a generation of European arrival, the indigenous Caribbean population had been reduced by an estimated 90%. In some islands, it was total. Their second solution was European indentured labor. Poor Europeans who agreed to work for a fixed period in exchange for passage and land. But indentured servants were expensive to transport. They had legal rights that were difficult to strip away. They completed their terms and demanded their land, and they died in tropical climates at nearly the same rate as everyone else. The solution they settled on was African enslaved labor, and the logic was coldly economic. Africans had immunity to tropical diseases, having lived in similar climates for millennia. They had sophisticated agricultural knowledge, particularly around rice, cotton, and cattle, that European colonists entirely lacked. They were physically robust, and crucially, they were far from home, spoke different languages, and had no legal standing whatsoever in European colonial law. They were, in the brutal arithmetic of colonial capitalism, the perfect labor supply. The first enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas in the early 1500s, transported by the Portuguese to Brazil and the Spanish Caribbean. But what began as a trickle would, over the following 4 centuries, become a flood, the largest forced migration in human history. And the architecture that would make it possible was built with extraordinary deliberateness at every level of society. The transatlantic slave trade was not an informal or disorganized affair. It was structured as a sophisticated, multi-leg commercial operation that we now call the triangular trade, and it was, in its day, the most profitable supply chain the world had ever seen. Here is how it worked. A ship departed from a European port, Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Amsterdam, Lisbon, loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, metal tools, firearms, alcohol. These were traded on the West African coast in exchange for enslaved Africans who had been captured in raids or wars and brought to coastal holding facilities called slave forts or barracoons. The ship then crossed the Atlantic, the infamous Middle Passage, packed with enslaved people under conditions deliberately calculated to maximize the number of bodies per square foot, while keeping enough of them alive to be saleable on arrival. Human beings were chained lying down, side by side, in spaces so confined they could not sit upright. The crossing took 6 to 8 weeks. Mortality rates ranged from 10 to 20% on average, and much higher in the early period of the trade. On arrival in the Americas, Brazil, the Caribbean, Virginia, South Carolina, the enslaved people were sold at auction. The ship then loaded up with the products of plantation labor: sugar, tobacco, cotton, rum, coffee, indigo. These were carried back to Europe and sold at enormous profit. Every leg of this triangle generated profit. The goods traded in Africa were manufactured cheaply in Europe. The enslaved people sold in the Americas were acquired for the cost of those goods. The plantation products carried back to Europe were produced by unpaid labor and sold at market rates. The profit margins at each stage were extraordinary. But what made this system truly powerful and truly modern was its corporate structure. In 1672, King Charles II of England granted a royal charter to the Royal African Company, giving it a legal monopoly on the English slave trade. The company's shareholders included members of the royal family, aristocrats, and the leading merchants of London. It was, in every meaningful sense, a state-backed corporation, with the Crown guaranteeing its contracts and the Royal Navy protecting its ships. When the monopoly was broken in 1698 and the trade opened to all British merchants, the volume exploded. Private traders, joint stock companies, and individual investors flooded in. Liverpool, a modest fishing town at the start of the 17th century, became, by the late 18th century, the single largest slave trading port in the world, responsible for approximately 40% of the entire European slave trade. The trade was insured by Lloyd's of London, the same institution that insures ships and cargoes to this day. Enslaved people were listed on insurance policies as cargo. When the captain of the Zong ordered 133 enslaved people thrown overboard alive in 1781, it was to make an insurance claim for lost cargo. The case went to court, not as a murder trial, but as an insurance dispute. That is the moral universe of this economic system. Human beings as line items, insured cargo, a balance sheet entry. One of the most persistent myths about the transatlantic slave trade is that its profits were confined to a small number of plantation owners in the Americas. The reality is far more distributed and far more uncomfortable. Let us map the beneficiaries. At the top, the plantation owners, mostly British, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch, who owned the land and the people who worked it. In the British Caribbean alone, the average plantation owner in the late 18th century was extraordinarily wealthy by any standard of the era. When slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, the British government paid £40 million in compensation. That was approximately 40% of the entire national budget. Not one penny of that compensation went to the formerly enslaved. It went entirely to the slaveholders. That debt, the loan the British government took out to pay those slaveholders, was not fully repaid until 2015. British taxpayers were still paying off the debt of slavery compensation into the 21st century. Next, the merchants and ship owners. Families like the Colstons of Bristol commemorated with a statue that was torn down and thrown into the harbour in 2020. The Cunliffes and Leylands of Liverpool, the DuPonts in America, whose early industrial fortune had connections to Atlantic trade networks, the Baring family, founders of Baring's Bank, whose fortune was deeply intertwined with American plantation finance. Then, the banks and financial institutions. Barclays Bank, one of the largest banks in the world today, was founded by the Barclay family, Quakers, who were deeply involved in the slave trade. The predecessor institutions of J.P. Morgan Chase in the United States held mortgages on enslaved people as collateral. Aetna Insurance, one of America's largest insurers, wrote life insurance policies on enslaved people. Brown Brothers Harriman, still one of the oldest and largest private banks in America, built its fortune in part on financing cotton produced by enslaved labor. Then, the textile industry. The cotton that enslaved people picked in the American South, under a system of terror and brutal discipline, supplied the mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire, which were the engine of the British Industrial Revolution. The economist Eric Williams argued in his landmark 1944 work, Capitalism and Slavery, that the profits of the slave trade provided the capital accumulation that directly financed British industrialization. His thesis remains one of the most debated and one of the most supported in economic history. And then, the consumers. Every person in Britain or France or the Netherlands who sweetened their tea with Caribbean sugar, who wore cotton clothing, who smoked tobacco, who drank rum, was participating in an economy built on enslaved labor, whether they knew it or not. The price of these goods was low precisely because the labor that produced them was unpaid. The profits of the transatlantic slave trade were not a separate stream that flowed into a hidden vault somewhere. They were integrated into the foundations of the modern Western economy. They funded universities, they built cathedrals, they endowed hospitals, they capitalized insurance companies, they financed the first factories. They are baked into the infrastructure of the modern world. Any honest accounting of the economics of the transatlantic slave trade requires us to address a part of the story that is sometimes avoided in popular discourse, but must be engaged with directly: the role of African kingdoms and merchants in the trade. It is true that some African rulers and traders participated in the sale of enslaved people to European merchants. The kingdom of Dahomey, in what is now Benin, became one of the most active suppliers of enslaved people to European traders, raiding neighboring peoples and selling captives at the coast. The Ashanti Confederacy in Ghana, the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa, and various merchant networks along the Niger Delta all participated to varying degrees. This is a historical fact, and it should not be erased or minimized, but it requires crucial context. Context that is almost always absent when this fact is deployed, usually by those seeking to deflect responsibility from European actors. First, African slavery existed before the transatlantic trade, but it was categorically different in nature. African forms of slavery were generally not hereditary. Enslaved people retained certain rights. They could own property, they could be integrated into families and societies over generations. The chattel slavery of the Americas, where a person was legally property in perpetuity, where their children were born enslaved, where they had no rights whatsoever, was a distinctly European legal invention. Second, the scale was transformed by European demand. African rulers were not operating a trade of this magnitude before European ships arrived. The transatlantic trade took existing limited practices and turbocharged them with European capital, European weapons, and European demand on a scale that was entirely unprecedented. European guns, traded for captives, shifted the balance of power between African states and incentivized raiding and warfare as an economic strategy. Third, the consequences were not equivalent. African rulers who sold captives enriched themselves in the short term, but Africa as a whole was catastrophically depleted. The long-term consequences, demographic collapse, destabilized political systems, militarized societies, and the loss of the continent's most productive people fell on Africa, not on Europe. The descendants of those African rulers who participated in the trade have, in recent years, begun making formal public apologies to the descendants of those who were sold, including the King of Dahomey's descendants apologizing to African Americans and Caribbean communities. That is a sign of moral maturity, not weakness. The economic historian Nathan Nunn published a landmark study in 2008 using shipping records and historical data that mapped the precise regions of Africa from which enslaved people were taken and compared them to modern economic development indicators. His finding was stark. The regions that suffered the most intense slave raiding during the transatlantic trade are today among the poorest and least economically developed in Africa. The correlation is not subtle. It is statistically overwhelming. Let us break down exactly what Africa lost. The first loss was demographic. 12.5 million people exported. An estimated 4 to 6 million killed in the raids and wars that captured them. Millions more displaced, traumatized, and rendered unable to contribute economically. Scholars estimate that Africa's population in 1850 was roughly the same as it had been in 1650. 2 centuries of demographic stagnation in a period when every other major world region was growing rapidly. Africa should have had at least double the population it did by 1850. Those missing people represent missing farmers, missing craftspeople, missing merchants, missing soldiers, missing mothers and fathers and teachers. The second loss was political. The transatlantic slave trade did not simply remove people, it fundamentally destabilized African political systems. States that had been built on agriculture, trade, and taxation were transformed into raiding economies, where the primary source of revenue and power was capturing and selling human beings. War became profitable, trust between neighboring communities collapsed, political alliances that had taken centuries to build were shattered by the incentive structure that European demand had created. The third loss was economic capacity. Africa was not a continent of subsistence farmers before the slave trade. It had sophisticated craft industries, metallurgy, textile production, long-distance trade networks. The people who were taken were disproportionately young, able-bodied adults, precisely the population that drives economic production and innovation. You cannot remove that demographic from a society for 400 years without catastrophic consequences for its productive capacity. The fourth loss was geopolitical positioning. While Africa was being drained, Europe was accumulating capital and using that capital to industrialize. The gap between European and African economic and military power, which had been relatively modest in the 15th century, became an abyss by the 19th century. It was that abyss, created substantially by the wealth flows of the slave trade, that made the colonial conquest of Africa possible. The economist Morton Yervin has estimated that the economic divergence between Africa and Europe that took place between 1500 and 1900 accounts for the majority of the development gap that exists today. In other words, Africa is not poor because of something inherent to Africa. Africa is poor because of what was done to Africa. What would the numbers look like if we tried to calculate a figure? Several economists have attempted this. Estimates of the total economic damage, accounting for stolen labor, demographic loss, political destabilization, and the compounding effect of foregone economic growth over 4 centuries, range from $10 trillion to $17 trillion in today's terms. That figure increases every year because foregone economic development compounds, just like interest. The last slave ship arrived in Cuba in 1867. Slavery was abolished across the Americas in stages: Haiti in 1804, Britain in 1833, the United States in 1865, Brazil in 1888. But the economic consequences of the trade did not end with the trade. In the United States, 4 million people were emancipated in 1865 with no land, no capital, no education, and no reparations. The promise of 40 acres and a mule, the proposal to redistribute confiscated Confederate land to formerly enslaved families, was rescinded by President Andrew Johnson within months of the Civil War ending. The land was returned to the former slaveholders. The economic gap between black and white Americans that exists today in income, in wealth, in home ownership, in access to credit, in educational attainment is a direct, traceable, documentable consequence of centuries of unpaid labor, followed by decades of deliberate exclusion from wealth-building opportunities. The black families who were building wealth during Reconstruction had it violently destroyed, most dramatically in the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, when the wealthiest black community in America, known as Black Wall Street, was burned to the ground by a white mob. 300 people were killed, 35 blocks were destroyed, 10,000 people were left homeless. No compensation was ever paid. In the Caribbean, the islands that produced the greatest plantation wealth for European empires were left at independence with colonial debt, monocrop agricultural economies, no industrial base, and no capital. Britain extracted an estimated $300 to $500 billion in today's values from the Caribbean over the period of slavery. At independence, these territories were handed a bill for their own liberation in some cases and left to build nations from the ruins of extraction. In Africa itself, the slave trade was followed, almost without pause, by formal colonization. The same powers that had grown wealthy from enslaved African labor now returned to colonize the continent directly, extracting its minerals, its agricultural land, its timber, and its tax revenue for another century. The generational impact of the transatlantic slave trade is not ancient history. It is present-tense economics. The wealth it created is still concentrated in the institutions and families that accumulated it. The poverty it created is still concentrated in the communities that were drained by it. The ledger has never been closed. The question of reparations, of material compensation for the economic damage of the transatlantic slave trade and subsequent colonialism, is sometimes presented as a radical or fringe idea. It is neither. Germany paid reparations to Israel and Holocaust survivors. Japan paid reparations to South Korea for forced labor during World War II. The United States government paid reparations to Japanese Americans interned during World War II. Britain paid reparations to Mau Mau victims in Kenya. The principle that states should pay for demonstrable, documented economic harm they have caused is firmly established in international law and practice. The CARICOM Reparations Commission, representing 15 Caribbean nations, has produced a 10-point reparations plan that includes not simply cash transfers, but full debt cancellation, technology transfer, educational investment, and a formal apology. It is a sophisticated economic and political document, not an emotional demand. In 2023, Barbados, Jamaica, and other Caribbean nations formally escalated their reparations demands to the British government. In the same year, several European cities and universities, including Glasgow, which received an estimated £200 million in today's money from plantation wealth, began making voluntary reparatory payments to Caribbean universities and communities. Whether full reparations are ever paid is a political question. But whether they are owed, based on documented economic harm, traceable wealth transfers, and the compounding consequences that persist to this day, is not really a question at all. The transatlantic slave trade was not a moral aberration committed by uniquely evil people who have since been replaced by better ones. It was an economic system, rational within its own brutal logic, that transferred enormous wealth from one part of the world to another and set in motion a chain of consequences that defines the economic geography of the world we live in right now. The banks that financed it are still open. The cities it built are still prosperous. The universities it endowed are still shaping global thought. And the communities it stripped in West Africa, Central Africa, the Caribbean, the American South, Brazil, are still working to rebuild what was taken. Understanding this does not require you to carry personal guilt for history you did not make, but it does require intellectual honesty. It requires us to stop explaining global inequality as a natural result of different capacities, different cultures, or different work ethics, and to start recognizing it as the result of a specific economic architecture built at a specific historical moment by specific people and institutions for specific financial gain. Once you see the architecture, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand the economics, the moral case takes care of itself. I want to hear your thoughts on this one. This is a topic that touches everyone in this community differently, whether you are in Lagos or London, Accra or Atlanta, Kingston or Kinshasa. Where do you stand on the reparations debate? Drop it in the comments. If this video told you something real, please share it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and if you have not watched prior videos, the links are right there. Build the full picture.